Strategic context. Early 1943, the strategic coordinates in the Mediterranean were complex and sensitive. After retaking North Africa and winning Tunisia, the Allies were looking to begin the next phase, penetrating southeastern Europe through Sicily and then Italy, or alternative options. But the military balance was such that accurate prediction of the Axis response, Germany and Italy, could make the difference between a successful invasion and catastrophic losses. The enemy had effective intelligence networks, and signals, evidence, and even intelligent analysis could quickly lead to decisions by Axis commanders. In such a situation, there were two simple and decisive facts. 1. If the Germans expected an attack on Sicily, the island would become a strong defensive point, and Allied casualties would increase. 2. Deception, not just through rumors or radio operations, but with tangible physical evidence, could displace enemy units and defensive resources, thus making the real battlefield safer for the Allies. The role of intelligence and the philosophy of deception. In the practice of modern warfare, physical information carries greater psychological weight than mere news information. A stamped document, identification card, or handwritten letter that can be touched and examined can be more credible than a radio or wiretap report. This psychological principle was one of the pillars of the operational theory that ultimately shaped Mincemeat. The planners wanted the Germans to not only have heard that an attack was coming somewhere else, but to have evidence that could be seized, examined, and incorporated into their analysis. Organization and key players. The work was carried out in the Naval Intelligence Division and related Special Operations Units. Two central figures who stand out in historical accounts are Ewen Montagu, the legal intelligence officer who provided the technical and legal direction of the documentation, and Charles Cholmondeley, who, with his skills in intelligence analysis and operational imagination, brought the ideas to fruition. The pair, together with a team of printing, set design, forensic dentistry, forensic medicine, and navigation experts, were responsible for creating the fake truth. At the same time, naval and submarine units for seaborne transport and release, and an intelligence network to monitor enemy reactions on neutral Spanish soil were planned in a coordinated manner. The effectiveness of the operation required careful cooperation between the technical and human branches, from selecting the right body to preparing the documents and choosing the beach and time for the release. Technical design of the deception. What distinguished Mincemeat from other deception operations was its extraordinary obsession with realism of detail. The deception design involved several overlapping layers. Persona building, the creation of a complete daily life for Major William Martin. Bank records, clothing receipts, love letters, identification cards, a photograph of his fiancée, and even natural handprints and scratches on the clothing. The aim was for the enemy analyst, upon first encounter, to perceive the documents as a kind of real life. Credible official documents. Letters written in an appropriate military and administrative tone, with stamps and letterheads that would appear acceptable from an official, formalistic perspective. Contextual plausibility. Choosing the right beach, tide time, weather cover, and style of placement so that the body appeared to be the victim of a plane crash or drowning, not a murder or an outright conspiracy. Enemy analysts would usually first match the cause of death by reading the documents and then examining the scene. So, consistency between the scene and the documents was crucial. Controlled leakage. The documents had to reach the Germans without any obvious British plot, that is, through a neutral country, Spain, that had an active German spy network. This would make the Germans feel that the documents had been discovered from a local source, a factor that added to its credibility. Legal and ethical issues ahead. The planning and execution of the operation faced serious ethical challenges. The use of an anonymous human body, even in wartime, raised serious legal and ethical questions. Could a human body be used as a military tool without the consent of the family? At the time, the planners of the operation responded with a rigorous cost-benefit calculation that the possibility of saving thousands of soldiers' lives justified such a coercive measure. This moral calculation was later criticized historically and philosophically. But in the context of those days of war, mass aid and avoidability of casualties shaped the decision-making criteria. Decision-making framework and risk analysis. The design of Mincemeat was based on a rigorous risk-benefit analysis. If the documents were not discovered, or if the Germans immediately recognized them as forgeries, the cost of the operation would be limited to the effort expended. But if the documents were accepted and led to the transfer of forces, the operational benefits would be enormous. The planning team explicitly considered the possibility of failure and its consequences, and also designed and managed a possible bad plan, simulated leakage, for example, choosing a neutral shore and completely concealing the route of the body's transport by submarine. Analytical summary of Part 1. Operation Mincemeat was born of a clear strategic need and a deep insight into the psychological weight of physical evidence in information games. What at first seemed like a strange idea, using the body as an information carrier, turned into an interdisciplinary project. Forensics, publishing, law, submarine navigation, and the psychology of enemy analysts all played a role. This careful combination of expertise, coupled with careful risk assessment and the moral calculus appropriate for wartime, set the stage for what was later called one of the most brilliant deception operations of the era. In the next section, Part 2, I will delve into the operational phase of constructing the identity of Major William Martin, a technical description of the documentation, the selection of Glyndŵr Michael's body, the medical and brainwashing processes that were necessary to make the fake life seem real, along with the technical analysis and rationale for each decision. If you're ready, I'll get into the details of constructing a fake life.
In the grey London winter, somewhere in the basement of the Naval Intelligence Office, dim yellow lights shone on tables covered with stamped papers. The sound of typewriters, the soft tapping of codes, and the whispering of officers in the corridors filled the air with anxiety and precision. In one of the rooms sat two men, Ewen Montagu, an open file before him, and Charles Cholmondeley, bent over a map of the Mediterranean with a pencil. On the wall behind them was a sign, written in bold letters, "Nothing deceives like the truth." And that sentence summed up the philosophy of the whole operation. They needed a body that could be put in a naval officer's uniform with the right credentials in its pocket and then dumped on the Spanish coast for the enemy to find and believe in its information. But finding such a body was extremely difficult, not only practically, but also morally. The coroners at St. Pancras Hospital drew up a list of unidentified dead, bodies lying in mortuary graves without relatives. Among them, one body caught Montagu's attention, a homeless man of about 34 years old who had died of accidental phosphorus poisoning. Glyndŵr Michael from Wales. His face was calm, and his death showed no signs of violence. For the purposes of the operation, his body was complete. He could have been the victim of a plane crash. In the autopsy room, the doctor carefully examined the body. It was necessary to ensure that there were no signs of decomposition or signs that would rule out drowning. The body was kept at a low temperature, and the necessary measures were taken to prevent tissue decay without artificial marks on the skin. Montagu, with a cold but precise look, signed the medical report. From that moment on, Glyndŵr Michael was no more. He became Major William Martin of the Royal Navy. In the weeks that followed, a new life was created for the dead man. On the desks of the intelligence office, papers and folders piled up, each part of his new existence. With meticulous precision, officers specialized in document forgery printed out, with official seals, official letters, and even small receipts from London restaurants. In his coat pockets, there were cinema tickets, keys to an imaginary house, and bank receipts. But what was most important was to create his human face. One long evening, Montagu and his colleagues sat at a table. On the table were several photographs of a young woman. The photograph was chosen with a gentle, sincere smile. A real woman named Pam, a secretary in an army office who was unaware of the plot. A letter was written from him, a love letter, in ink that had been slightly smeared to make it look more natural. It read, "My dearest William, I can't wait for the war to be over so we can walk by the Thames again." A small chain with a silver cross was placed next to it to be worn in the officer's pocket. This human detail was more important to the designers than the military documents themselves. For if the enemy believed the man had really existed, then any documents that accompanied him would be considered real. Military documents were a vital part of the operation. 2 official letters were drawn up between British naval commanders containing information that the Allied invasion was to be carried out through Greece and Sardinia rather than Sicily. The sentences were carefully chosen to sound natural but deceptive. Military terminology and the commander's real signatures were used, and the letters were placed in leather envelopes to ensure authenticity. In addition, details such as a fake airline ticket, a half-burnt cigarette packet, and even a lip print on the rim of a coffee cup were left on the napkin. Montagu knew that enemy analysts would look for small, unintentional clues in documents, not just text. Every stain, every fingerprint, every crease in the paper could be evidence of authenticity or forgery. He told his staff, "The deception must be so subtle that even the truth would learn from it." Meanwhile, plans were being prepared to transport the body. The Navy ordered an S-class submarine to deliver the body to the southern coast of Spain at midnight. The reason for choosing Spain was obvious: a neutral country but with an active network of German agents. If the body were found there, the information would almost certainly reach the German command. On the maps, a spot was marked near Huelva, a secluded beach with calm currents. Meteorological studies, wind direction and water temperature suggested that releasing the body there would enhance the realism of drowning. In the final week of preparation, a small room in the basement of Whitehall became known as Martin's Room. All his equipment, documents, and military uniforms were stored there. The clothes were scented with a faint scent of tobacco and special soap to give them a real-life feel. Even the washing dates on the collar tags were meticulously updated. The officers touched them repeatedly with ungloved hands to give the impression of being used. In effect, they were creating something that had to look real-life, yet artificial. On a cloudy day in April 1943, Montagu reviewed the documents for the last time. He held a brown leather briefcase containing false documents. In his notebook, he wrote, "Now he is complete. The man who never existed is ready to change the war." That night, the body was placed in a special metal cylinder with a preservative solution and silently transported to Greenock Harbor to be delivered to the submarine HMS Seraph. Only a few officers knew its true destination. The official report listed it as carrying a classified cargo for oceanographic experiments. At 3 in the morning, in the thick Scottish fog, the submarine pulled out of port. Gentle waves lapped against its steel hull, and no one knew that inside it lay a nameless man, silently carrying the greatest lie of the war. On the deck, Commander Bill Jewett looked out at the horizon. In his mission notebook he wrote, Cargo, Major William Martin, handle with care. No one knew that this imaginary officer would soon become one of the most effective factors in the victory in the Mediterranean.
Early in the morning of April 30, while the Huelva coast was still shrouded in the cold, damp morning mist and fishermen were busy setting out their nets, news of the discovery of a body spread rapidly through the port. The body was wearing a half-soaked navy uniform, a khaki, blistered uniform, marks of bruises and abrasions that seemed consistent with a story of drowning in a plane crash, and, most importantly, a leather envelope tucked neatly into the pocket of the coat. An envelope that made the stamps and official documents inside noticeable. The first local response was to collect the body and contact the city authorities. The basic military honors were performed and the body was transferred to the port morgue. But in a city like Huelva, where the German intelligence network was already well established at the time, especially naval officers and agents from the German embassy in Madrid, the news quickly reached higher circles. The local authorities, with their formality, seized the documents and began the legal process of identification, which, as usual, required a careful examination of the documents, an explanation of the cause of death, and notification of the circumstances of the death to higher authorities. The passage of the documents from local hands to the German intelligence network was a relatively short process. German military representatives quickly contacted their embassy in Madrid, and the documents and observations of the scene were sent to Berlin for analysis. What made this process so crucial was the quality of the documents and the level of human detail that accompanied them. Personal and official letters, identification cards with numbers associated with naval units, official seals, and documents in British official language, all designed to appear at first glance as authentic and intact evidence. The initial analysis was local. Spanish officials who were trying to maintain diplomatic relations because of their official neutrality referred the documents to consular authorities so that the identification of the body could be officially notified to the British government. But other channels moved faster than the official ones. German intelligence agents in Madrid and Seville picked up the documents. A copy was tested for technical content and encryption, and a copy was sent to Berlin. Meanwhile, Spanish officials were also privately aware of the importance of the matter and tried to proceed with diplomatic caution so as not to expose themselves to direct conflict with either power. The Germans, at that time keenly interested in any clues to Allied plans, examined the documents with operational obsessiveness. German naval intelligence analysts, military offices, and cipher channels each took their turn. The text of the letters, the style of writing, the stamps, and even small handwritten marks that might indicate forgery or inconsistency with the real documents. But the situation changed once a powerful German intelligence analyst, one whose technical weight was sufficient to make decisions at the highest levels, approved the documents as authentic. At Madrid level, German agents wrote to Berlin with detailed reports. A British officer has been found with documents relating to operational movements in the Mediterranean. The documents include letters referring to dates and locations, which are likely to indicate Allied supply planning. Such reports aroused so much curiosity and attention that the matter was eventually brought to the attention of the high military staff in Berlin and the inner circle of Reich commanders, who themselves had to respond strategically. Between the initial review and the final decision at the highest levels, several key factors played a role. First, the quality of the documents discovered and their consistency with other information. Second, the need for a rapid decision in the face of a potential threat from the Allied southern flank. And third, the German commanders' prior confidence in the ability of their intelligence networks in Spain to detect and confirm events. When German analysts in Madrid and then in Berlin read the documents, some of them were struck by the sensitivity of the evidence with analytical precision. The format of the letter, the style of writing, the stamps and addresses were all too convincing for ordinary analysis. But in London,
The small group of planners, Montagu, Cholmondeley, and the other authors, were busy and waiting. They carefully monitored the listening channels and intelligence reports to see how the enemy would react. A fundamental component of the operation was that the enemy would not ignore the documents. Therefore, improving the credibility of the documents and ensuring that they were transferred from neutral Spanish soil to German decision-making centers was part of the success of the operation. In Huelva, next to the morgue and the harbor, the story of his discovery took on a more formal form. The official medical report on the cause of death, the description of the wounds, and the testimony of the fisherman who had found the body. All of this was arranged in such a way as to confirm the coherence of the scene and the documents. This was something that the planners of the operation had already taken into account, that every outward sign had to fit the death story. The German spy network in Spain, which included diplomats, local intelligence officers, and a variety of human resources, quickly discussed the findings in secret. Some reports indicate that German analysts were initially cautious, as they should have been, but that the passage of time and the superficial examination of the documents gradually reduced their initial suspicions. As strategic decision-making required the combination of multiple sources of information, these tangible documents, the body and its documents, quickly gained more weight. When the packages of documents arrived in Berlin, they were evaluated in secret meetings of commanders, experts from the Navy and the high staff. Those with a history of engagement and analysis on the Mediterranean front read the documents. Seals were checked, signatures matched, and cross-analyzed with previous intercepts and intelligence reports. Finally, the initial observations and impressions from the documents found were followed up with operational rigor. Unit movements and redefinition of defensive lines were reviewed, in a process that took perhaps no more than a few days, but whose consequences on the field level were immediately apparent. The German commanders decided to shift part of the southern defense force, a move that created exactly the situation that the mincemeat planners had wanted: a reduction in the defensive focus on Sicily and a greater concentration of resources on Greece and the Balkans. While the German move was apparently influenced by the documents discovered at Huelva, other operational factors also played a role in the appropriateness of the decision. But the importance of the psychological weight of physical evidence in this strategic shift is undeniable. And so it was that the dream body of an imaginary officer was first found in the fog of the Huelva coast. Then the documents he carried passed through the regional intelligence networks and German decision-making centers, and ultimately influenced the deployment of military resources in the field, an effect that would later have major consequences for the Mediterranean theater of operations.
When Major William Martin's dossier fell into the hands of German analysts, it went through a formal and rapid process of review, a chain of command from local agents in Spain to the high command in Berlin. The documents were seemingly simple: military identification cards, official letters from the command, bank receipts, laundry bills, movie tickets, and a love letter from Pam. But what mattered was not the individual items, but their network of symmetrical logic, the link that established the official and private elements and allowed the analyst to read the documents as more than a single document, as a reflection of a social and organizational reality. In Berlin, the intelligence and military offices tasked with analyzing Allied activities in the Mediterranean quickly deployed teams. Figures with combat experience in North Africa and the Mediterranean, naval officers and intelligence experts reviewed the documents. Seals were matched, names cross-checked, and the contents matched against intercepts and previous intelligence reports. This vetting had two very important considerations. First, the coherence of the content with previous German knowledge of the Allied program, and second, the assessment of the possibility of a deception operation. The German analysts began their work with skepticism. Skepticism in matters of intelligence is natural and healthy. In war, the enemy is always trying to identify factors of disruption. But skepticism here quickly gave way to the weight of evidence. Official letters contained signatures in official language that were in keeping with British official standards.
Stamps were of proper official form. Receipts and small financial lists seemed to indicate routine transactions. Love letters and other private documents also gave the documents a human dimension that German analysts rarely overlooked, for purely technical documents could be fabricated, but emotional and everyday documents required more sophisticated imitation. The initial report from Madrid was sent to Berlin and read in the High Command Office. Among high-ranking officials, assessments varied. Some said the documents must be forged and a more rigorous test was needed. Others warned that even if they were forged, the danger that the Allies would resort to such a deception was too real to ignore. In this climate of uncertainty, the role of a credible analyst with technical and managerial weight became crucial. Someone who could say with relative certainty that the documents were authentic and that decisions should be made on the basis of them. This credible figure in the German analytical chain was not simply looking for signs of fraud, but also for the exact correspondence between the text of the documents and the reality on the ground. He looked at such things as the date of the stamps, the synchronism of the bank transactions, and the pattern of the alleged travels. Eventually, analysts with a technical and empirical view of such documents gradually came to judge that the evidence had a degree of authenticity that could not be easily dismissed. It was this technical decision that paved the way for political and military decisions. The timing of the decision was crucial at this point. The information received required immediate action, since the Allies were about to launch amphibious operations. From the German command's perspective, the best preventative response was to redeploy forces to areas where the likelihood of Allied targeting was enhanced. So what had previously been considered merely an interesting report, or possibly an intelligence trap, now had to be tested at the level of equipment movement and unit transport. Military decision-makers in Berlin, those charged with maintaining the mother lines of defense in southern Europe, met in decision rooms with senior analysts and commanders on land and sea. Technical discussions arose about the ability to monitor Allied movements, the possibility of naval and air support, and the need to protect the supply routes to North Africa. They ultimately gravitated toward a precautionary measure, shifting troops to the Balkans and Greece as a possible barrier and shield against an attack that now appeared, on the evidence, likely. This move was not limited to the transfer of a few battalions. It required extensive logistical planning. Artillery pieces, infantry, air units, and transportation resources all had to be redeployed. Such a change in the defensive position, in addition to the direct cost of mobility, meant a reduction in the concentration of resources where the Allies could actually attack. And this was precisely the effect intended by the designers of Mincemeat. In London, Montagu and Cholmondeley followed the reports closely. They watched for signs of a German reaction through listening channels and intelligence communications. Every coded message, every change in the configuration of enemy movement, and every request for supplies sent from Madrid or Berlin was intensely analyzed in their office. And when a few days later, reports of unit movements and reinforcements of the Balkan defenses arrived, what had begun in London, a meticulously crafted intelligence ploy, was slowly beginning to have its desired strategic effect. But on the German mind, the incident left a deeper mark, an increased sensitivity to new forms of deception and the importance of multifaceted analysis. There was a lesson for them too. Physical evidence, when combined with the right environmental narrative, could bypass many analytical systems. The experience would later be recorded in German intelligence records as a warning and a test of trust, at the cost of diverting resources and damaging the defenses in Sicily. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of the Allied operation, the Mincemeat team was still monitoring the outcome, but they knew there was no guarantee of a perfect outcome. Deception could only provide the conditions for chance. The field execution of the operation and tactical luck had to work in its favor to produce the final result.
In July 1943, as the Mediterranean skies were expecting bomber fire, The Allied fleet had mobilized for the operation that was to change the fate of the southern European front. Codenamed Husky, the operation was a complex combination of naval, air, and land forces. Huge transport fleets carrying troops, heavy combat escorts, preemptive air strikes to soften the defenses, and initial landing groups to provide bridgeheads for the main invasion. The design of Operation Husky was based on the principle of surprise and concentration on shifting points on the Sicilian coast, but the precise shape of the Axis defenses on the island, both German and Italian, was a function of their intelligence network and analysis. As the Mincemeat planners in London had hoped, the forged documents found at Huelva increased German pessimism and focused their attention on the eastern Mediterranean front. As a result of this information exchange, the German hand in distributing defense resources was more freely distributed, and gaps were created in the fortifications of Sicily. On the day of the invasion, the Allied naval forces arrived in a variety of formations. British and American fleets approached from the west and southwest. American and British armored and infantry units landed from several coastal areas, supported by fire from ships and bombers. Before the main assault of the landing forces, bomber and fighter squadrons began interference operations and suppression of enemy air defenses. Accurate airstrikes were made on hangars, potential minefields, and artillery positions until the landing parties could reach the beach. When the first boats reached the sandbanks, enemy resistance was in some areas relatively scattered and uncoordinated. This disorganization was partly a product of the uneven distribution of forces, partly due to the superiority of Allied naval and air fire. German units, taking the possibility of an attack on Greece and the Balkans seriously, had moved some battalions and heavy artillery away from sensitive areas in Sicily and towards the eastern Mediterranean and Greece. A move that was time-consuming and logistically demanding, and which left parts of the Sicilian coast considerably less protected. In the field, Allied commanders, who had prepared themselves for a hard fight, realized the opportunity that had arisen. The offensive moved faster than anticipated, local defenses were broken through, and rapid naval and air support helped to consolidate the landing beachheads. Armored and infantry units disembarked from the ships, supported by naval artillery and frequent close support aircraft, advanced and broke through the defensive bottlenecks. The Axis response was also initially scattered and slow. Some local Italian commanders were hesitant, and conflict between the Italian and German command on how to respond and allocate remaining resources prolonged the response time. Field reports indicated that local forces, especially in areas that had not been reinforced earlier, lost their relatively quick and firm resistance. Meanwhile, German units, arriving unexpectedly through other openings or arriving late, were trying to prevent a complete collapse. But the tactical situation was in the Allies' favor. They had air and sea superiority and provided high mobility for the delivery of supplies. The consequences of the intelligence deception at the operational level were more pronounced than initially anticipated. Not only were units repositioned, but defensive priorities were also changed, and defensive boundaries were redefined. Considerable amounts of fixed artillery, heavy vehicles, and support forces were transferred to areas that were never the main focus of the Allied offensive. This transfer of resources left the defenders on some fronts short of ammunition, equipment, and even effective command. In the context of war decisions, such a mistake cost the Allies a loss of tactical and local superiority, and the Allies benefited from it. From the perspective of military pathology, Operation Husky was an example of the successful synergy of intelligence deception and naval air execution. In other words, the success was due not only to the deception alone, but to the combination of that deception with careful planning of the attack, the coordination of fleet fire, and air support. If the Mincemeat documents had not diverted German attention elsewhere, the Allies might still have faced a more formidable obstacle in Sicily, and the human cost and time of capture would have increased. On a human and psychological level, Husky had a profound effect. For Allied soldiers, the rapid victory on the island symbolized the combined effectiveness of intelligence initiative and firepower. For German commanders, the partial defeat in Sicily was the catalyst for a serious rethinking of intelligence analysis methods and a greater sensitivity to physical evidence. This event made the Reich High Command more wary of further deceptions, but at the same time, it contributed to fatigue and a reduction in the ability to react quickly, as resources that had been moved would sooner or later have to be returned. In the weeks and months following Heskey, the strategic consequences of the capture of Sicily expanded. The Allies used Sicily as a launching pad for an invasion of Italy. The supply lines of the Axis in South Europe were weakened, and finally the pressure on Mussolini's government was increased, leading to political changes in Rome. Heskey's field achievements, along with the psychological impact of Operation Mincemeat, became an example of how subtle intelligence operations could have a tangible impact on military design and ultimately on the political geography of war.
Early on the second morning of Operation Heskey, the sun was shining faintly on the waves of the Mediterranean, and the shadows of the ships and landing craft on the calm waters created a picture of alertness and expectation. The infantrymen, from American to British, were gathered in the landing craft, each anxiously and carefully making a final check of their equipment and weapons. The sound of the boat's engines, combined with the chirping of birds and the crashing of the waves, broke the tense silence that everyone knew as the silence before the storm. James Harper, a 19-year-old British soldier, later wrote in his memoirs, "Every moment I felt my heart pounding in my chest. The waves rose and fell, and we stood on the edge of the boats, waiting for the moment of landing, not yet knowing what horrors lay ahead." Meanwhile, American troops were having a similar experience. Teenagers, fresh from beach exercises and training grounds, were now facing the reality of war on the water. As the boats reached the shores, the first waves of soldiers disembarked and moved under enemy artillery and machine gun fire. The sandbanks were filled with smoke and dust, and every explosion sent a wave of anxiety and trepidation through the troops. The soldiers had to navigate through minefields and barbed wire with skill and concentration. For many of them, it was their first time in real life and a situation where fear and courage were tested simultaneously at every step. Meanwhile, American troops were having a similar experience. Teenagers, fresh from beach exercises and training grounds, were now facing the reality of war on the water. As the boats reached the shores, the first waves of soldiers disembarked and moved under enemy artillery and machine gun fire. The sandbanks were filled with smoke and dust, and every explosion sent a wave of anxiety and trepidation through the troops. The soldiers had to navigate through minefields and barbed wire with skill and concentration. For many of them, it was their first time in real life in a situation where fear and courage were tested simultaneously at every step. Meanwhile, individual stories revealed the spirit and resilience of the people. A soldier named Henry Dubois, who had only been at the front for a few weeks, later described how he single-handedly managed to get several wounded men to safety. Elsewhere, a group of American soldiers, under artillery fire, were building a temporary bridgehead to allow armored vehicles to advance. Cooperation, initiative, and quick decisions were changing the tactical balance in favor of the Allies. Another aspect of the battle was the presence of support and medical aid. Nurses and volunteer soldiers, at great risk to themselves, treated the wounded and carried them back to the front. British nurse Dorothy Wilson wrote in her memoirs, "The sound of explosions rang in my ears every moment, but I had to go and save them. Nothing else mattered." These sacrifices not only saved many lives, but also strengthened the collective morale of the troops. At the same time, the Axis forces defended the beaches with all their might. Tanks, machine guns, and heavy artillery fired accurately on the target, but the dispersion and poor concentration of their forces allowed the Allies to capture vital points. Many of the defending units, due to the pressure of misinformation and deception, were deployed in unsuitable positions, and this weakness helped the attackers to advance more quickly. In the interior of the island, local resistance also developed. Italian soldiers and some German units tried to hold the paths and hills, but as the successive waves of Allied troops landed, the defensive lines were broken one after another. The battle took the form of small, scattered local battles. In villages, along rivers, and in small forests, soldiers resisted with guerrilla tactics and gunfire from behind trenches, while the Allied forces, aware of their weaknesses, continued to advance. By the end of the second day, the initial lines had stabilized, but the human cost was high. Many soldiers were wounded or killed, but the advance continued, and stronger bridgeheads were established. Every soldier who survived that day became part of a larger narrative that depicted not just the ground battle, but a combination of intelligence, tactics, individual initiative, and collective courage. This day became the foundation for later successes, demonstrating that even in difficult conditions and under heavy fire, human spirit and cooperation could change the course of a war.
When the third day of the operation began, the sun had just risen, its pale light reflecting off the waves of the Mediterranean. The sound of explosions and artillery fire still hung in the air, but the Allied forces, with the experience of the previous 2 days, moved more systematically and more harmoniously. The new arrivals, still haunted by the horrors of the first landings, carefully joined the lines established by the previous waves. They knew that any small movement could lead to the advance or the complete retreat of the operation. On this day, the engineer units played a vital role. They cleared scattered mines and barbed wire obstacles, providing safe paths for armored vehicles and direct fire attacks. The infantry, with courage and precision, crossed these paths and captured the enemy's defensive positions one after another. In many places, close contact and direct fire had put both sides under severe strain and attrition, but the experience of the previous 2 days had sharpened the Allied endurance and coordination. At the same time, Allied air forces had once again stepped in to provide increased fire support and target any enemy concentration. Bombers and fighters were hitting their targets with precision, clearing the way for the ground advance. The soldiers on the ground knew what was coming from the sky, but fear combined with awareness and concentration enabled them to make split-second decisions in the extreme conditions of battle. Wounded and exhausted soldiers were being carried off the battlefield, aided by comrades and nurses. At every moment, stories of sacrifice and bravery emerged. A soldier rescuing several wounded from artillery positions, a group clearing safe routes for armored vehicles, and nurses and volunteers bravely risking their lives to save others. These sacrifices not only helped save lives, but also strengthened the collective spirit and cohesion of the operation. As the hours passed, the bridgeheads became stronger, and Allied forces were able to completely break through the enemy's initial defenses. Using field intelligence, Allied commanders directed forces for the next phase of the operation, and the advance continued toward strategic points in the interior of the island. Each step taken was the result of a combination of individual experience, teamwork, planning power, and air and naval coordination. As night fell, with the light fading and the field becoming relatively quiet, the soldiers had a brief opportunity to regroup and prepare their equipment. The sound of explosions could still be heard in the distance, but the relative silence of the night allowed the troops to prepare for the next phase. Individual memories of that day were filled with fear, courage, hope, and solidarity, and each formed an important part of the grand narrative of Operation Husky. In the end, the success of the third phase and the consolidation of the bridgeheads laid the foundation for the continued Allied advance into Sicily and later into Italy. The day demonstrated that in war, the combination of individual courage, collective cooperation, tactical initiative, and air and naval support could change the course of operations and have enormous strategic consequences for the rest of the war. The human spirit, sacrifice, and coordination of the forces were ultimately able to turn the tide of the battle in favor of the Allies, even in difficult conditions and under heavy fire,
and provided the foundation for subsequent successes.